for folks that are joining us for the first time, hello and welcome. This is the Apologetics Academy. My name is Jonathan McClatchy, and I host this weekly webinar every Saturday at 8 p.m. UK time, which corresponds to 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central, and 12 noon Pacific. And every week we bring on different scholars, thinkers, experts from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present to us and talk to us about topics of interest to Christians, particularly those topics which pertain to the question of whether or not Christianity is true. We also evaluate and critique and cross-examine alternative worldviews and points of view such as Islam, Mormonism, atheism, and so on. There's a number of ways you can participate in today's discussion. You can simply watch and listen anonymously, or you can participate in the chat window. Please, if you're doing so, direct chat to everyone rather than just panelists so that more than myself and Perry can see it. You can also submit questions by hitting the Q&A button at the top of your screen and typing in a question in textual form, and I'll direct that to our guest speaker. You can also click the raise hand button, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our guest speaker, and you'll have the opportunity to interact and engage with him in dialogue. Just to give you an idea of what's coming up in future weeks, we have next Saturday, April 29th, Jackson Washburn, who's going to be giving us a presentation on why I am a Mormon. He is a Mormon apologist. You might recall that he tuned into our webinar that we did with Mormon, ex-Mormon actually, Lynn Wilder, who gave a critique of Mormonism, and he's going to be giving his side of the story to give us a defense of the LDS Church. Then the following week, on Saturday, May 6th, we have a famous atheist philosopher, Dr. Stephen Law from University of London, who's going to be giving us a presentation on why I am an atheist, and then we will be interacting with what he has to say. And then the following week, May 13th, we have Dr. Ola Hoster, who is a population geneticist. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. The following week, we are going to be interacting with Dr. Ola Hoster, who's a population geneticist. That's May 13th. And he is going to be talking to us about his recent publication in biocomplexity, along with which he published along with Dr. Ann Gager, called A New Population Genetics Model for Human Origins. And he's going to be giving a population genetics model for human origins and asking whether it's possible that modern humans descended from just two individuals. So coming back to today's webinar, we have with us Perry Marshall, who is the author of a book called Evolution 2.0, Breaking the Deadlock Between Darwin and Design. I actually met Perry at the Royal Society meeting in London, which convened in November last year to discuss the status of textbook orthodoxy in relation to Neo-Darwinian evolution. And a number of the intelligent design people were there, and a number of a few of the sort of classical Neo-Darwinians, including Douglas Fatuma, were there. And then there were also the so-called third way evolutionary theorists promoting a new view of the evolutionary mechanisms. And Perry Marshall basically subscribes to the third way evolution viewpoint. He will maybe give us some information on what that entails. Perry, do you want to do you want to add anything to your introduction? Do you want to introduce yourself further to those that are tuning in?
Well, I'm just really happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Jonathan. And I think we're going to have an interesting conversation today. I think that Christians have kind of missed the punchline on evolutionists, and so have most of the Darwinists. And I think there's another way of looking at it that makes more sense of the data and is also very consistent with a classical theistic understanding of science. And so the Royal Society meeting, I thought it was basically the Protestant Reformation of evolutionary biology. It was very interesting to be there and witness it all. And people that may not be familiar with that meeting, I think you're going to find this quite fascinating.
Absolutely. So do you want to maybe tell us a bit about what you mean when you talk about evolution 2.0 for those that maybe haven't heard this concept before?
So I got into this subject because I was drug into it. My younger brother went from card-carrying conservative Christian with seminary degree, and furthermore, he was a missionary in China. So, I mean, he was all in. And in space 4 years, he went to almost being an atheist. And we're very close. We're both pastors' kids. We both had a very substantial theological background. And so, like, the emails were flying back and forth for a couple of years. And it just kind of kept going. And one day I was visiting him in China, and we get into this argument, and I finally went somewhere I had not gone with him before, which was science. And that had to do really with the fact that, he kept pushing my buttons on all these different topics. And and these were pretty difficult. I mean, I thought I was pretty good at apologetics stuff, but you've never done apologetics until you've done it with a guy who's got a master's degree in theology from a very conservative seminary, and he knows Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and he's been through the New Testament inside and out. That's a whole different ball game than like being on Infidels or something, okay? Or talking to a Richard Dawkins fan. It's a whole different ball game. And I started retreating to science because I know science. I'm an electrical engineer. And I said, Brian, look at the hand at the end of your arm. I said, this is a fine piece of engineering. He goes, you don't actually think this is a random accumulation of accidents, do you? And he's like, hold on a second. And he just comes back at me with really a standard Neo-Darwinian response. Now, I didn't necessarily buy what he was saying, but what I did know was that the majority of biologists would probably be more in agreement with him than with me. And I knew from having an electrical engineering degree that there are a lot of things in science that are extremely counterintuitive, and that there might be a whole department in biology that I knew nothing about. And so I said, I'm going to find out. I'm going to go down this rabbit hole, and I'm going to take it wherever it leads. And it's almost like I think my keenest sense of how the world is in science and engineering. It's less squishy than theology. So let's see what happens with this. And I did. I really flung myself into the void, and it was pretty scary. I mean, I was willing to become an atheist if that's what the evidence led. I hoped it didn't make me into a jerk like a lot of the atheists that I seem to meet on the internet. But in any case, it was like, wherever this goes, we're going. So let's see. And I floundered around for quite a while. Well, the really short version, and we can go into the details of anywhere you want to go, Jonathan, but the first thing I figured out was that DNA is a digital communication system. And I wrote an Ethernet book in 2002. It's called Industrial Ethernet. In fact, it's right here. This is the second edition. The third edition is coming out this year. It's published by the world's largest trade organization for process control engineers. So I'd written this book about how the ones and zeros go back and forth across the wire, and that's like really great insomnia material if you can't sleep. However, it really is fascinating. I mean, it's like anything. You get deep enough into it and you get familiar with it. It's really, really amazing, all of the engineering and the technology that goes into, like you and I, Jonathan, on this connection, the packets going back and forth across the internet. There are so many ways that those things get dinged up and interfered with, and they crash and they noise breaks the packets and stuff. And they just have these ingenious ways of making sure that it happens intact and it happens in real time. And it's just spectacular. And so it really is quite fascinating. And we all like just take it for granted because we pick up the phone or we text, but I'm telling you, it's amazing. Well, I'm in the middle of this tunnel of chaos. I'm torn between all these different views. I'm trying to make sense of it all. I'm completely overwhelmed, and I'm just looking for something I can grab onto. And one day I'm reading about some of the finer points of DNA, and I suddenly have this moment of recognition. In fact, it was like this 15-second brain on fire epiphany. It's like, wait a second. All this stuff in my Ethernet book is in DNA. Oh my word. Whoa. Like, whoa. And it was, at first it was just like this, this flash of intuition, okay? But in that flash of intuition was, hey, wait a minute. So that means I should go looking for this and for this and for this and for this. Like, kind of like in about 10 seconds, I thought of a dozen things that probably I would find if and sure enough, absolutely it was true. Checksums, error correction systems, error detection systems, redundancy, forward error correction, things that like even most IT guys don't even know about, okay? And oh my goodness, wow. So I can dissect this. Evolution is an information processing problem. It's a software engineering problem. I wrote an Ethernet book. I know analog signal processing. I know digital signal processing. You can reduce this to mathematics and you can go after it. Oh, okay. Well, so that was the first piece. Okay. Now the second piece came a couple years later. And this is where it gets really interesting. Now, what I had, like, up to this point of what I've just described, what I really had was an exquisitely good intelligent design argument, okay? Because there's a million codes out there, and 999,999 of them are designed, including HTML and barcodes and zip codes and Chinese and English and on and on and on, and Morse code. And then there's one code we don't know where it came from. It's called DNA, and it's actually a lot more sophisticated than Ethernet. So I'll be darned, like, this has every appearance of being designed, and exquisitely so. So that, all right, so that's kind of interesting, and it fits in a nice, neat little box. And okay, that's interesting. But what about evolution? Well, that immediately indicated that there was no possible way that Neo-Darwinism could be true. I mean, it wasn't even remotely possible, and here's why. When I was arguing with Brian on that bus, Brian had been trained well by reading the blogs and the books and stuff that he had seen so far. And he was like trotting out the mantra that they all get. He goes, so Perry, listen. He goes, let's say there's 1 billion falcons flying around for like 100 million years or something. He goes, that's a lot of falcons. And I'm like, that's a lot of falcons. And he goes, so if there's a DNA copying error and it happens to make its vision better, and then it can hunt better and out survives the other falcons, then you get better falcons. And he goes, all you need is like a few million years of that. You could get almost anything. And I'm like, well, maybe, except like I never seen that happen in engineering. Like, they never taught us that in engineering. It never came up in engineering school. I'm not so sure about that. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's something I don't know. So I start looking into this. Well, it's digital code, and it's got error correction systems, all this kind of stuff. Well, digital codes never get better when you copy them wrong. I mean, you can run an arc welder next to your TV for 100 million years, and it's never going to make the picture better. You can run it a little bit, you can run it a lot, you can run it near, you can run it far away, you can run it 1 million times around 1 million TVs, you can do it 1 billion times around 1 billion TVs, and it's never going to make it better. And so I knew there's no way that that explanation is what's really going on. And I was tempted to dismiss evolution itself. But I kept finding all this anecdotal evidence, and it was anecdotal. Most stuff that evolutionists talk about are anecdotal. They're not really experimental. At least, especially the classic textbook kind of stuff. It's more like people putting fossils on a table, arranging them a certain way, and then just telling a story. And I, but there, I saw a lot of evidence, and I said, I think there's something going on here. I don't think I can ignore this. And I started asking the question, well, if evolution is true, what else would have to be true? And I kind of had this kind of murky idea of some things that would have to be true. And one day this guy sends me an email and he goes, Perry, take a look at this. And it was a paper by James Shapiro. And it was describing several things. It described an experiment by David Prescott where he put protozoans under stress. And, they're in serious peril. And they rearranged their genome. They cut their genome into 100,000 pieces and rearranged it like in 12 hours or something. I mean, unbelievable. And he talked about Barbara McClintock, who I had never heard of, who I since have become very familiar with. Barbara McClintock won the Nobel Prize in 1983 for discovering that something that her colleagues 40 years earlier laughed at her. I mean, they thought she was crazy. They're like, plants don't rearrange their own genomes. Cells don't reprogram their DNA. And she's like, yes, they do. Absolutely, they do. And, after dozens of other people had confirmed this, it finally became undeniable. And she discovered something called transposition, or AKA jumping genes. And it turns out just about every cell in existence has the ability to transpose DNA, change gene expression. And so what began to unfold, and this was about 10, 11, 12 years ago that I started discovering McClintock and all this, was that there's a whole gold vein of biological research that hardly anybody talks about. It is exquisitely well documented. There is no denying it. It is, we're talking thousands of papers. We're not just talking a little bit, that show that cells dynamically respond in extraordinary ways to situations in the environment. They take hundreds of inputs and they synthesize that into exquisitely precise responses to threats. And so I stumbled onto what is now called the third way movement. And what living things do is so amazing. The thesis of my book, Evolution 2.0, is Darwinists underestimate nature and creationists underestimate God. And I think that's really true. I think that Christians who are fighting against evolution are actually throwing away the biggest chess queen on the whole board. I think most Christians got this completely backwards. And so that's what I'm here to talk about today. Anywhere you want to go with any of that, Jonathan, I'm up for it.
Sure. So do you want to maybe tell us what distinguishes your view from intelligent design?
Well, it depends on what you mean by intelligent design. If you mean intelligent design, lowercase I, lowercase d, writ large, in the broadest possible sense, meaning that I think the universe and everything in it is exquisitely engineered and fine-tuned and all that kind of stuff. I'm with you. I am totally with you. If you mean intelligent design in the sense of Discovery Institute, Seattle, Washington, which most of the time, when you really get down to it, means old Earth creationism, or possibly even young Earth creationism, I disagree. I think that's a short-sighted view of nature. It fails to recognize how adaptive nature actually is. So I'll just give you an analogy. Jonathan, I imagine you've probably used DOS, like, right? And probably a lot of people listening are old enough to, you know, before Windows Desktop and before, you know, you got that command line thing and you're typing dir and you're getting a directory, old version, like the original Microsoft, right? So I want you to imagine that Paul Allen and Bill Gates came up with DOS in 1981, and that no human engineer touched it ever since. I want you to imagine that there was no employees in Redmond, Washington all during this time, and that DOS evolved into Windows in 35 years. I want you to imagine that happened, and just stick with me for a second. I want you to imagine that it developed a Windows desktop. I want you to imagine that it developed an Ethernet connection and a mouse connection and antivirus software and Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel. I want you to imagine that all of that developed in response to everything that was going on around it. Competitive pressures and new tech, other, you know, things from the outside. And then here we are with Windows of today. If the original DOS could do that, would you be impressed?
Very.
Okay. You would, like, your view of Bill Gates would go from here to here.
Indeed.
Okay. That's how I think Christians should view evolution. We've got this thing totally backwards. We can observe new species emerging in 24 hours or 24 days or 24 weeks or 24 years. It actually happens. No, software doesn't do this, and my automobile doesn't do this, and my bicycle doesn't do this, and my computer doesn't do this, and the apps on my iPhone don't do it, but living organisms do. And they don't do it by accident. Hello. I mean, this is what the Darwinists have completely gotten wrong. This does not happen by accident. In fact, the hypothesis that it does happen by accident is not even a scientific hypothesis, because you can't reduce it to any kind of a systematic explanation or process. I think what the third way people are doing is they're actually beginning to reduce it to a systematic process. And so I just want to invite y'all to put on a different hat and think about this differently. If you want to fight scientific materialism and reductionism, there's no better tool than the way evolution itself actually works.
Okay, I have some questions on that, but I'm going to go to our first hand, and then we'll come back to some of these things. All right, we've got a hand from Tim Hall. Go ahead, Tim. How are you doing?
Hi, Tim.
I'm great. How's it going, Perry?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I don't know if you attended the March for Science today, but I had a chance to walk with some of the people that on the March for Science. Did you get a chance to do that at all?
I don't even know where it is. I'm sorry.
They're all over the place. There's one in London, LA. I'm in Chicago right now on a trip, so they're in Chicago. Great. So my question was, and I'll kind of just dive in here because for other people's time's sake. So you just explained a little bit about that. Can you just be a little bit more specific on where God comes in the process of your intelligent design, little I, little d? Is it and he front-loaded the design at the beginning of creation, or that he's still active in the world? Or can you just help me with some of that?
Well, I don't really know. I think there's several possible answers. Let me start by bringing out something else into the mix that I think is important. I'm a Christian, and I know that God is active in the world because I've seen miracles happen right in front of my own two eyes. I've been in the room twice when people deaf for more than 30 years got their hearing back. Okay. And so, like, I do not have any experience of some kind of a deistic God. Okay. But if a miracle happened 100,000 years ago and nobody was there to see it, we can't learn anything from it because, like, nobody's there, right? It's not reproducible, anything like that. On the other hand, if a step in the development of life, or a step in the creation of life, was actually a naturalistic process that was an outgrowth of the properties of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, if the universe and the earth are themselves fruitful and have the ability to, in some sense, create themselves, if there are scientific processes that we can discover, then there is more that we can learn from nature than if it was a miracle. And so I have a bias when we don't know what happened 1 million years ago or 10 million years ago. I have a bias to prefer a naturalistic explanation, because a naturalistic explanation would be equivalent to saying, so how does that DOS reprogram itself and build a Windows desktop? How does that Windows desktop become, Windows 95 instead of Windows 3.0 and then become, how does that happen? If there is a process that we can understand, then we can read the book of nature, as Augustine said. We two books. We have Scripture and the book of Scripture and the book of nature. I think Christians have seriously underestimated the book of nature, and the atheists have downright molested it.
Is that all from you, Tim? Are you there, Tim?
Maybe we lost him for a sec.
Okay. There's a few questions that people submitted. Alistair says, did punctuated equilibrium really move the goalpost, i.e. to cover up big holes in evolution theory? Or is punctuated equilibrium not that significant change in understanding of fossils?
I think we can observe punctuated equilibrium. So there are two ways that you can get a new species in a very, very short period of time. One is hybridization, and the other one is symbiogenesis. So I'll give you an example of hybridization. If you cross two plants together, one of which is a weed, you get modern wheat. Okay, and you get it immediately. Yeah, you double the number of chromosomes, you get a new plant that is substantially different from its predecessors in some cases. This happens all the time in botany and in the plant world, and it happens occasionally in the animal world. If you take donkey plus mule, donkey plus horse equals mule. Mules are almost always male, they're almost always sterile, but they're not always male and they're not always sterile. And you can sometimes get a completely new species. So it is in theory possible for there to be a species of mules Because there have been female mules, there have been non-sterile mules. So that's one way. Another way is symbiogenesis, which is merging of organisms, of two organisms become one, sort of like putting a Starbucks in the lobby of a Marriott hotel. You're merging two businesses together. This is how we got chloroplasts that make leaves green. A chloroplast is actually a blue-green algae. That is what it is. It has its own DNA. It reproduces independently. It merged with a plant cell and became the energy engine that turns carbon dioxide and sunlight into energy. I have a friend, Quan Zhang, from the University of Tennessee in Memphis, and he did symbiogenesis experiments, and he got cells to merge together. This is the whole focus of Len Margulis's work over the last 30 years, and these are both examples of punctuated equilibrium. And so biological evolution is very, very similar to the evolution of human technologies. So you have nothing but paper and ink for years and years, and then somebody invents a phonograph, right? And then we have LP records, and then all of a sudden we have cassettes. And then the cassettes, they very gradually improve by just little tiny increments, and then you have CDs, punctuated equilibrium. Okay, then CD technology, it improves and it matures, and then you get streaming or whatever comes after that. Biology evolves the same way by an almost identical process, and it is driven by the intelligence of cells. Now, most biologists are reluctant to call it intelligence because the word intelligent is so loaded. Okay, but you'll find the word cognition a lot, and you'll find linguistics. There's a whole vein of literature about the linguistics of cells. Not only cells communicating to each other, but how they restructure their own genomes and how they store information internally. And so we don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes, but I think we can learn more about the universe and have a higher view of God if we assume that nature itself is front-loaded from the word go.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting. On some level, I feel like it's almost I'm interested in what you just said there, kind of at the end. I thought the information was great, but how you're saying that you have a greater view of God by trying to find the systems that he set up. That seems to me like you're eliminating some of his ability to freely interact with his creation at will. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's tinkering because it wasn't right in the first place. It could in some sense mean that as an artist continues to paint, the picture becomes more clear as the artist is painting, in a sense. So I guess I'm wary of saying that, of like discounting things in the past as God interacting with his creation on some level. And the other thing, just as a kind of maybe a side note, I always cringe anytime I ever hear anybody, so this isn't just you or anybody else, associate the Discovery Institute and intelligent design with creationism, or particularly young earth creationism, because it's just one of those things as an apologist, as a professional apologist, that I'm like, no, don't do that, don't do it. Because I just had a conversation with someone like about a week ago that they could not get off that cycle. They're like, intelligent design is Christianity, creationism, young earth creationism. If you're ID, you're young earth creationist, and that's just it. And then you just want, that's all your end game is. Just keep pushing it forward. So that's just kind of a side note. But anyway, so my main question.
Well, actually, let me grab that piece right there of what you said. Okay. So I quote this in my book, and this originally came from the Discovery Institute website. It says, ID asserts that the same principles of design employed in architecture, computer science, manufacturing, music are valid and necessary in science and biology. Okay? And that would even be intelligent design writ large, like lowercase I, lowercase d, okay? Now, when I debated Stephen Meyer at the Discovery Institute on the Unbelievable Show with Justin Brierley a couple months ago, you can listen on my blog, cosmicfingerprints.com. I was advocating what you're hearing here, and he was not liking it. He's like, no, you need an outside intervention in order to get these evolutionary steps. And he was giving all these reasons. And I'm saying, no, nature is endowed with this ability to evolve, and he's like, you have to have almost a mystical, omniscient view of nature in order to believe this sort of thing. Now, I don't personally object to, that's his view, whatever, that's fine. But the view that he was giving me, old earth creationism is what it was, okay? He was not satisfied with my lowercase I, lowercase d, there is intelligence here. He was not okay with that. And then there's further blog back and forth with between me and those guys. And
I would be careful just on that point, to separate out the movement of ID and what it's trying to do and the specific person that holds it. So I guess
that's fair.
If I'm arguing as an ID proponent, I'm not going to bring in my view of old earth creationism or young earth creationism or whatever. I'm going to argue from the science to say we have things like the waiting time problem. We have Michael Behe's book called The Edge of Evolution. I have lots of other things that I don't even have to go in the biblical creationist model to argue for whether or not there is a philosophical need for some kind of outside intelligence based on the science in order to fulfill the level of design that we see today. So, and I think Meyer's in the same boat, is where he's saying, sure, on some level, if you're asking about what Stephen Meyer is going to debate about, what he particularly believes, he might say, I believe in an older creation. I'm not saying he does, but I'm just saying he might argue from that standpoint, or a theistic evolutionary standpoint or whatever. But just in the same sense that for you, you wouldn't want to be shoehorned into saying that, well, the resurrection of Jesus must have been a naturalistic happening, just because that could have been front loaded into the design.
Let me give you.
Are you that at some point Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and we'll say it's 100% natural, because then then you're like, we don't really know.
Well, so when those deaf people got healed, I mean, I can't crawl inside their ear and rerun the tape, but it definitely happened. In fact, one of them was documented by the Charlotte Observer. I mean, this stuff is on my one of my websites anyway. But let me give you a bit of perspective. Do you recall a book by Guillermo Gonzalez called Privileged Planet? And it's really fascinating. And there's a lunar eclipse, and the corona of the sun, it's like the moon and the sun are the exact same size in the sky. And because of this perfect coincidence, you could make these observations that you couldn't make any other way. And he comes to realize that we're in the right little arm and the right corner of the galaxy for maximum observability of the universe. And it was almost like we were put here to maximize our ability to collect the data and observe the grandeur of it all. Okay, is that you're nodding your head, right? You remember that? And I'm going, okay, so let's just do a little comparison thing here. There's not very many people, not very many Christians who would say, I think God stuck the sun right here and stuck the earth right here and stuck Mars here and stuck the moon here. And there aren't very many people that would think that God has to like interfere with the planets and the galaxies. I think the idea that a very fine-tuned universe and a Big Bang 13 billion years ago with all of the fine-tuned constants, like that's all great, right? And it takes us backwards if you do what Isaac Newton did, for example. His math said the planets ought to be, spinning off into space, and they're not. So I think God must push him back. And Laplace comes along and he goes, no, you got your math wrong. They stay in orbit. You didn't do this right the first time. Okay. Now I think we can all appreciate that was a mistake on Newton's part, and Laplace corrected him. I think Christians are doing the same thing with biology. Now, I think you have a theological question of, well, what about miracles and what about, but see, my theology and my experience of it is God breathes the breath of life into the man and he becomes a living being. Humanity becomes spiritually aware, however that works, okay? And then man and God start going on this journey together. I don't see any reason to believe that nature and God were on this journey together before that, and there was all this other stuff that was going on. And if the universe is designed for maximum observability, then biology is a natural process, and that we can take it apart. And I would just suggest to you that the creationist camp would never produce a Barbara McClintock or a Lynn Margulis. They miss, I have debates on my blog like literally every day with people. They're like, evolution, no. And I'm like, dude, you're missing like the biggest story ever, because Ken Ham programmed you to think that this is compromise. Like, take a chill pill and loosen up your underwear, dude, because you're missing like a really amazing thing here. And it frustrates me to no end. Like, people are really missing. It's like, here, I got this chess queen. Why don't you take it and kick my ass? Like, and this is what's been going on in evolution for the last 100, well, at least 75 years. No. Do you like getting your butt kicked? How about take the chess queen back and start kicking butt yourself? That's my message to all the apologetics people out there. Like, evolution is your friend.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think that's one of the areas that, it's one of the reasons that I love having conversations with Jonathan and, having these conversations with you, as I'm not a biologist. My wife is a PA. That's about as close as I can come. So I've read some of her medical books and I've interacted with a number of people. But Perry, I love what you're doing. And I love your enthusiasm. And I'm going to jump off and let somebody else jump on and ask some more questions. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. And
Tim, thank you. Great to have you.
Thank you so much, Tim. Let me just pick up from there and ask you. And I listened to the debate between yourself and Stephen Meyer on the Unbelievable program, and I did not think that he was peddling old Earth creationism in that particular encounter. Old Earth creationism, creationism is kind of a slippery term. It's defined by different people in different ways. The way that I would define creationism is the attempt to interpret the natural world in view of and in light of a particular interpretation of a religious text, such as Genesis 1 through 11, right? Would that be a fair definition?
Sure, that's fair.
And Steve Meyer, in his debate with yourself, did not bring up any religious text or scripture at all throughout the entire debate. How then can you say that he was peddling old Earth creationism?
Well, I'm going by inference. If he's saying, look, there's no way nature is smart enough all by itself to explain the Cambrian explosion, you have to have something from the outside. Then you're like, okay, so what is it from the outside? Well, it's either aliens or God. You've only got so many choices, and I think that a lot of ID people kind of shoot themselves in the foot by not putting their cards on the table. It's like, they're not willing to say God, and like they're kind of trying to dodge around it. But look, like everybody knows intelligent design, yeah, it could mean aliens, but that doesn't solve anything. And everybody pretty much knows that too. Even if it is true, like it still doesn't explain where they came from, you know, so it's like you end up with God. And I'm like, well, I believe in God, but I just think a front-loading view of things, or even endowing nature itself with a degree of intelligence and a degree of freedom, is simply a lot more elegant, and it takes this war between science and religion off the table. And I just find it a whole lot more effective when I'm talking to non-Christian people, especially scientists. I think the interventive version of intelligent design, where there's these repeated things showing up in history, it makes scientists cringe, and the reason is because it essentially takes away their job. It says you can't figure this out, and they're like, we've been figuring this out for hundreds of years. Don't tell us we can't figure this out. On the other, but then. And what it does is it opens up room for people on the opposite side to go, oh, you know, it's just a happy chemical accident. You know, like Richard Dawkins said on a radio show once. I mean, I was like, you got to be kidding. Like, you expect educated people to believe that, but then they actually do, you know, like, oh my word. Like, but
the reasons that I mean, you know, I used to work at the Discovery Institute, so I know quite a lot of these people over there.
I didn't realize that. I'm very sorry. I didn't do my homework good enough.
No, I worked there for a year, and so I know the people there quite well. And the reason that they're not talking about God in the discussion over evolution is not because they're trying to pull the wool over everybody's eyes, and not because they're trying to sneak religion into the classroom or something like along those lines, as is often alleged. But rather, they are, I think, just trying to be honest about the extent to which the scientific evidence can take us. I mean, the scientific evidence can, in my opinion, take us to the inference of design, but I don't think the scientific evidence on its own is sufficient to get to the hypothesis of God. I think that requires some further philosophical work than simply the scientific evidence. So, I mean, one could, for example, I mean, there are agnostics who support intelligent design.
Sure.
I mean, until recently, until recently, Michael Denton, who was one of the architects of the intelligent design theory, was not a theist. He recently became a theist a few years back, but he was an agnostic before that. David Berlinski himself is an agnostic. Dr. Steve Fuller, who's a sociologist and philosopher at the University of Warwick, who's pro-intelligent design, is also agnostic. So there are different viewpoints beyond simply the theistic interpretation of design. You could even maintain there's some sort of natural intelligence built into the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Which I believe is true. I think there is. Right.
But the question of theism versus extraterrestrial intelligence versus intrinsic teleology or sort of Neoplatonic ideas, that is a philosophical discussion rather than a scientific discussion. The scientific evidence, in my opinion, supports the design hypothesis. And then, in my opinion, the theistic design hypothesis is the best explanation of the overall evidence when you factor in the cosmological evidence, the fine-tuning evidence, and so forth. So I think that's where I would distinguish intelligent design from creationism, and that's also where I would say that by not identifying the designer as God explicitly, that's not to say that, if someone asks us who we think the designer is, that's not to say we're not going to say what we believe is the God of the Bible, because that's what I believe and that's what Steve Meyer believes. But we're just trying to be honest about where the scientific evidence, how far it can take us. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So would you disagree with that response?
So then you get into a very nuanced thing, but here's where I think the rub is. The friction comes when you're talking about common descent, right? Mm-hmm. The idea that all life forms are literally descended from one, and not just sort of related, in some abstract way, right? That they really are related. Now, I think common descent is a far more parsimonious, elegant model, it's highly desirable from a scientific point of view to have common descent. Okay, it makes everything neater and cleaner. Whereas it's like, oh, if all Cambrian explosion requires this outside intelligence to show up and do something, now you have this very, very messy question. Well, how does that work? Okay, and it certainly implies that science can't really go any further, and I think that is a problem, because then at that point, intelligent design is at war with evolutionary biology, and I just don't think that's necessary or helpful. I think back to my Bill Gates analogy, I think it requires a higher view of God to embrace what we really actually know about evolution. And having said that, I think there's also a place for a certain amount of demilitarized zone, or a separation of church and state, where can we practice the science without always getting ourselves into a theological, spiritual argument all the time, because that actually sometimes just becomes more harmful than helpful. And you know, I think it's a real slalom. I am extremely careful to respect the work of scientists in vis-a-vis my theological views, and I've gotten quite a bit of cooperation and respect from secular scientists who are out there of whatever their religious views are, because I stick to the science, and they feel that my book kind of sticks up for them, whereas I think a lot of scientists really do feel threatened by intelligent design. Now, whether they should or not, I mean, that might be a different story, but they really do feel threatened by it.
Mm-hmm. Are you open to the possibility that many scientists actually reject common ancestry, not based upon theological convictions, but based on the evidence?
Well, that's fine. You know, I'm fine with evidence, and you know, having said everything that I've said, I love the fact that people disagree, and even people that I think are kind of kooky sometimes have really brilliant observations. I mean, they just do. Even if you disagree with 90% of what they say, from time to time, their peculiar point of view, you know, so, all right, so like my friend Paul Nelson, you know, he doesn't buy common descent, and I do. Well, so, you know, he gives talks and he writes papers and he talks about this stuff, and he brings up all this stuff. And every time he brings up something and he's like, see, this doesn't fit, I have to put stuff on my little chalkboard, like, I haven't figured this out. Sometimes I have to expand my views. I have to admit that, well, you know, he could be right. I mean, it's not like we really, really know. I have to admit that I have a philosophical bias where I really think that we can solve this, and there is a certain amount of faith in that. And, you know, vive la competition. I think that's great, as long as we can agree amicably.
Sure. Because you said that you interact with people on your blog, and you tell them, you know, that they've been, you know, brainwashed by Ken Ham and his Creation Museum and things like that. And you know, I disagree with young Earth creationism, but I also, I did a master's in evolutionary biology and did another master's in molecular biology, and I've read quite a number of textbooks. You know, I've read, you know, Jerry Coyne's What Evolution is True, and Ernst Mayer's What Evolution Is, and Dawkins' Great Issue on Earth. And I read a lot of the primary scientific literature on the subject of evolutionary biology, and I'm not convinced by the scientific evidence that common ancestry is actually correct, and it's not based upon my theological views, and it's not based upon having been brainwashed by Ken Ham and his Creation Museum and this animatronic dinosaurs and things. But I've actually taken the time to look at the evidence, and I don't find the evidence convincing. And I know that there are other people associated with the Discovery Institute who are in a similar position. to that. Paul Nelson would be one of them, Jonathan Wells and Doug X and others. There, Rick Sternberg, who's actually an evolutionary biologist. So it's not simply, I think it's a little bit more complex than simply theology versus science, right? Would you be prepared to grant that?
Yeah, I'll grant that. And so, one of the things I liked about the Royal Society meeting, and this is kind of a subtle point, but they didn't trash the Neo-Darwinian old school guys. It had the tables have been reversed for years, and the Neo-Darwinists are, many times they're just jerks, and they want to pound people into the ground. And Dennis Noble and Jim Shapiro and these guys, they did not want to create that kind of atmosphere, and they didn't. It was congenial, it was sane, it was polite. And what I hope that we can bring into the evolution discussion is a much more sane, reasonable, respectful, admitting what we don't know, confessing what our assumptions and our biases are, and putting them out on the table, and just giving people more breathing room. I think there's so much more to be learned. And I thought it was culturally, it was a victory in the biology community that this meeting was so congenial. You guys were there, and there's people they don't like you guys, but it's okay. Nobody's got their panties in a wad about that, and it's great.
When I listened to the debate you did with Steve Meyer on Unbelievable, I was surprised because I heard you say that you used to be an intelligent design proponent, so you used to be on the intelligent design boat, and then you switched to this position that you now adopt. But I was a bit puzzled because in the course of the discussion, you said that intelligent design was a God of the gaps argument. And I was surprised that you would make that claim, having been an ID proponent in the past.
Well, it isn't. So here's a perfect example.
Yeah.
DNA is a code.
Mm-hmm.
All the other codes are designed. Therefore, DNA is designed. Rocks are not. DNA is. Well, first of all, that's perfectly logical. I started making that argument in about 2005. In fact, I gave a fairly famous talk at Willow Creek that went viral, and it's called "If You Can Read This, I Can Believe God Exists." And fast forward to now, I have a $3 million technology prize searching for origin of information chemicals to code. You can go to naturalcode.org, and I've got a private equity investment group all organized, and I've formed a corporation. It's all out there. And if somebody can win this and it's defensively patentable, we'll write you a check for $3 million and we'll buy you the patent. Well, so here's the thing about that. If you say this is not solvable, nobody's ever going to figure this out because God stuck his finger in the ocean and he miraculously, he breathed the language of DNA into the first living cell. Now, theologically, I'm fine with that. Scientifically, I'm like, I don't know that that's the case. I know that there's exquisite level of design evidence in DNA. So what's really going on here? Well, you've actually got 5 possible answers. God did it. Chance did it. Undiscovered law of nature. It was a spontaneous, let's see. Sorry, just make sure I get this right. God, chance, aliens, undiscovered law of physics, or it seems like a combination
thereof,
or maybe a spontaneous accident or something like that. Well, so God, I think realistically you end up with God, aliens, or undiscovered law of physics, undiscovered property of nature. Well, We don't know. And if there is an undiscovered property of nature, it'd be like one of the top 10 discoveries of all time. And the more I thought about this, the more I realized it's actually more valuable to leave this as an open question rather than to say, see, God did it, there's your answer. In fact, I've been having this conversation now with people for 12 years. And I've had it peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. I tried it every way that you can imagine. And I have found that the most productive way to have that conversation is say, we don't know, we've got a technology prize to solve this. And then and then people sit there with a question. And it's really interesting, like, so what if somebody solves this? Well, Jonathan, think about it. Okay, what if somebody figures out a way you could pour chemicals in your bathtub and you do these certain things and you have these electric fields and all of a sudden you get digital communication going from one side to the other. Well, then what? Well, what did you do? Did you create consciousness? Did you discover some other thing that nobody even has any, like, well, it's just going to raise more, right? Is it going to eliminate God? Like, oh, we finally eliminated God. Well, I can't think of any other scientific discovery that finally eliminated God. So, like, I don't know how deep the rabbit hole goes. But again, I'm reluctant to make pronouncements like, no, there is no natural process that could have done this. And
but in regards to the way that you propose the formulation of the ID argument, it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. So it's not merely saying one DNA is a code or the genetic code is a code, two, all other codes are designed, three, therefore DNA is designed. That's not the argument. Rather, the argument is based on the historical abductive method, and it's an inference to the best explanation. So it's as arguing that in all of our uniform repeated experience of cause and effect, information content or codes come from intelligence, rational, conscious, deliberative agency. Right. And so when we look at the information content in DNA and RNA, the best explanation or the most causally adequate explanation of that information is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. Now, it might be possible in the future that some better explanation will come forward, and then that will then be the best explanation. But when we're formulating scientific hypotheses to try and explain events in the past, we have to deal with what we currently know. We have to deal with the evidence that currently presents itself to us. We can't we can't hold off because there might be a better explanation in the future. Otherwise, we'd never be able to make scientific progress. So it's an inference to the best explanation rather than an argument from ignorance, right?
Well, right, but see, I don't think there's any difference between the long version you just gave and the short version of my 3-point syllogism. Like, I don't really think there's any difference. It's just you have more words to explain it than I do, but you end up with the exact same explanation.
Right, but you'll notice that I carefully nuanced it by saying that intelligent design is the best explanation or the most causally adequate explanation,
right? Rather
than this.
And I'll just say it's the best current explanation, and I'm going, well, so I'm admitting what we know, which is that it's intelligence, but I'm also admitting what we don't know is that we didn't actually observe how it happened, and that we still could. It could be reproducible, right?
But any explanation that you put forward is only going to be the best currently known explanation.
Correct, because science is inductive, and that's the best that science can ever do. So right. Science never gets away from philosophy, and it never gets away from something that you can't prove. I mean, Gödel's incompleteness theorem proves that this is like in the fabric of reality, that there's always something you can't prove.
Right, but surely extending your argument further, every scientific conclusion in regards to the best explanation of an historical event would have to be an argument from ignorance, because you could always conjecture that in the future there will be some explanation which is a better explanation.
So I'm seeing a comment go by really quick, like they just kind of flash on the screen for a second, and somebody goes, so I'm not seeing what's new about evolution 2.0. Well, I only saw that one little sentence, but there is not another book written in plain layperson English that explains how evolution works. There's not another one. Now, if you're a PhD level biologist, you can read Jim Shapiro's fantastic book, Evolution of You from the 21st Century, and Dennis Noble's new book, Biological Relativity, is very readable, and maybe it's a recent exception. But what my book does is it explains, I call it the Swiss Army knife of evolution. It explains, this is symbiogenesis, this is what it is, and this is how it works. This is transposition, this is epigenetics, this is horizontal gene transfer, and it goes through and it shows the actual experiments that most people have never heard about. Most people in the Neo-Darwinian side, they've never heard about this stuff. Most people on the creationist or intelligent design side, they've never heard of this stuff. Like, I'd been paying attention to the ID guys in 2005 or 6, whatever that guy emailed me that paper. Nobody told me anything about that stuff. You read Stephen Meyer's book, Signature in the Cell, or Darwin's Doubt, you would never get the impression from reading those books that you would never get the clear impression that there are systems in biology that can get you from one species to another in a short period of time, that you can get massive rearrangements of genetic information, or that cells create their own information, which they do. It gives you the impression that an outside intelligence has to come in and create the Cambrian explosion. So Evolution 2.0 is different. It is not like any of the other books out there, and people need to know this. If you know this stuff and you get in an argument with a Darwinist, they are going to be backpedaling just like Doug Fatuma was backpedaling, or Russell Landy was at the Royal Society meeting.
We actually talk about James Shapiro's work and similar work all the time in the intelligent design community, so I think it's not quite correct to say that we're not familiar with this.
Well, but you make it very clear that you don't buy, that you don't think, and this is in the blogs arguing back and forth about the recent debate I had with Stephen. The Discovery Institute clearly does not buy the third way hypothesis that these kinds of systems can explain the diversity of life.
Well, sorry.
Can't talk to you. Sorry. No, out. Sorry. A kid asking for soft drink. Not the time. Okay.
Yeah,
my apologies.
That's okay. Don't worry. Of course, we affirm that these evolutionary mechanisms, which were discussed at the Royal Society meeting, are real processes. What we reject is that they are causally sufficient to explain the complexity of life. So it's not that we're not aware of these things; we just reject the conclusion that you're drawing.
And you don't say nearly enough about them. I mean, there is. I think. Now, I don't think that the current toolkit that the third way movement has is enough. Okay, it's not adequate. Okay. However, can you hang on a second?
Yeah.
Okay, my apologies.
No worries. Go ahead.
So, do they have it all figured out? No. But their approach is essentially correct. And I think it's got it deserves way more credit than you guys give it. And I think this gets to the essence of why the scientific community won't play ball with the intelligent design movement. It's because it essentially comes down to ID is God of the gaps, despite what they say. And the scientist says, no, I think I can figure this out. So, I mean, you're welcome to your opinion, but I don't think it's serving you. I don't think it's helping.
Okay, we
I
had a
see
hand.
Charisse is on.
Yeah, I was just about to say we have a hand raised from Charisse, so I brought Charisse up. Go ahead, Charisse.
Hi.
Hello and welcome.
Hey. Thanks for coming on and explaining your point of view. We only had a very brief chat at the Royal Society, so I didn't have a chance to get the full thesis, I suppose. So this has been really helpful. I listened to your debate with Stephen Meyer this morning, the radio broadcast, and so I really want to get down to some terms, because you use some terms a lot, and I'm all about let's define what we mean when we say these things. And so one of the terms that you use is evolution. And I'm wondering if you, how you would precisely define evolution. Do you make a distinction or acknowledge the distinction between, let's say, evolution as simply change over time, or evolution as speciation from basically what some people would call macroevolution, like the jump from one kind to the next, like dinosaurs to birds to, whatever.
Well, when I say evolution, when I say evolution 2.0, I'm talking about going from perhaps one single cell to the entire ecosystem that we have on Earth.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool.
Macro evolution.
Right. Okay, and then the mechanisms for macroevolution, you're saying, are a simple continuation of the same mechanisms for microevolution. That is to say that whatever you can observe in real time, like let's say with the Lenski experiment of ongoing generations of E. coli, or what we would observe in diversity within the human population, which we know there hasn't been speciation from the first human to every human. Now we're all humans. So whatever diversity is there, whatever mechanisms put it there, those are the same mechanisms, just do it a little bit longer or a lot longer, and you get
no.
No? Okay. Explain.
No. The Lenski experiment will never get you anything substantially different than what he's already got.
Why is that?
Because he's not putting them under extreme stress, and he's not forcing them to do symbiotic mergers with other organisms. Okay, so this is a key. So I mentioned this briefly earlier. I mentioned Quan Zhang at the University of Tennessee. He produced a successful symbiogenesis experiment. And what he did, he got bacteria, he put a certain kind of bacteria, and I think it was amoeba proteus, I might be off on a detail, together. And they fought like cats and dogs for 18 months. But at the end of the 18 months, some of the bacteria had merged with the amoeba and were now living inside. So you have big cell with now little cells living inside, and each of the two had modified their own genomes and their own physiology to the extent that if you separated them, they both died.
Okay. So now you would call that that event speciation.
That is a macroevolutionary event.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Can you define for me what are your thoughts on the species problem? That is, that there's not one definition for species that fits for all types of organisms. And what would you posit as a good working definition for the word species?
The working definition that I use in my book is if they're not able to breed, if two species cannot breed together successfully, then they're separate species. Now you have to incorporate into all of this. You have to incorporate the fact that you can get hybridization and genome duplication by taking two similar species with the same number of chromosomes, crossing them together, doubling the number of chromosomes, and getting a new species, which you do in one generation. Okay, so it's like horse plus donkey equals mule, except the mules go on and become their own species and reproduce. which would happen if mules were not sterile. And it does happen with plants.
Mm-hmm.
It happens all the time.
Okay.
Now, what you need to look, I want you to look up Ono's 2R hypothesis. And it is the theory that a genome duplication got us from invertebrates to vertebrates in a massive step, and that another genome duplication got us from vertebrates to jawed vertebrates in a single step. And I talk about this in the book.
Okay, so but you would recognize that that might be a way we're getting some macroevolution, but it can't possibly explain all the macroevolution because.
Well, I'm saying that it can.
Oh. Okay.
I'm saying that it can. This is how it happens. So you don't get. So if we take dogs and we breed dogs,
okay,
we're never going to have anything but dogs.
Okay.
Okay, that's a fact. And if we take Richard Linsky's bacteria and they keep going, he can run that experiment for the next 1,000,000 years. And if he keeps them fed and everything, and he keeps them in the same container, they're never going to change. Okay? The only way that you get massive jumps in evolution is extreme stress and mergers.
Extreme stress. So, sorry, when you say extreme stress, that seems like that is maybe what you're calling a driving factor, but I haven't heard of like on the level of genetics, like a genetic level threshold for when we would consider an organism or a population of organisms a new species, because right, like you could read about allopatric speciation, right, where you have speciation within the same niche, same environment. You don't need stress for that. How do you explain that?
Okay. Well, you obviously.
Oh, sorry, Patrick. I misspoke.
Okay, so sympatric speciation happens, but look up the history of wheat. Where did wheat come from? Wheat came from a merger.
Yeah, plants happen. So I guess what I'm saying is
it happens in animals too. It just happens less often.
And it happened from the common ancestor of chimps and humans?
Yes.
How to come? Where's the genome duplication?
Well, there's not. I am not aware that there's a genome duplication from chimps to humans. I think population genetics will get you there, but genome duplication gets you from invertebrates to vertebrates and from vertebrates to jawed vertebrates. Now, when you talk about primates to humans, it's not my area of specialization, and I think there's other people that could probably give you a lot better information about this. Dennis Venema at Biologos, for example, I think he has some good material on this. But I want to point out there are 287,000 mobile genetic elements that are common to primates and humans and not any other species.
Okay, can I get
287,000? So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Economically restricted genetic elements, yes, there's lots of anecdotal evidence of that. So one other thing that's really important is, how do you define naturalism? Because what I am getting a little confused about is your mechanism for design is like in situ, as I'm just calling it that, in situ cognitive design of essentially the consciousness of the organism, directing the reprogramming of that organism's genes in response to environmental stressors and future needs, and that being the driving force for diversification. And what Steve in your debate, what his response to that is that that's still intelligent design. It's just putting the designer in a different location. And it's also saying that the knowledge of what the needs are would have to be, would have to be present with the consciousness itself. So for example, like, I mean, and I think your hypothesis is really interesting, and I don't have like a fundamental problem with it per se. But I do wonder, like, it's a little counterintuitive in this sense. Like, I can imagine maybe spiders can do this, because you know what's amazing to me about spiders? They engineer webs across all kinds of different gaps, okay? And there might be moving and different weather, and they can pump 11 types of, at least, maybe more, 11 types of webbing out of some orifice in their body, like essentially at will as they need it, while they're designing this thing that specifically fits the place where they want to like catch bugs. Okay, I think spiders are amazing. I can't imagine an orifice of my body like excreting anything by will, like saying, ooh, I want to sweat Kool-Aid right now, like wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. Like, no, I don't have control over that. But what you're seeming to say is that there is some kind of connection, there is a mechanism by which our conscious mind can direct the either mutational processes within our cells, or like so that what we think are mutations are not accidental but actually chosen by our mind, or to, instead of like point mutations and stuff, like through the process of replicating our DNA, actually just in some phase of the cell cycle saying, now we're going to take this whole thing apart, put it back together in some algorithmic fashion, because hey, we anticipate that the next generation, let's say this happens in our gametes, because that was the only way that evolution would become relevant for it, is you're saying like, okay, I really would want my child to be able to, you know, survive Texas summers. Now that I have moved to Texas, I think, okay, if I just think really hard, like I can make those changes happen in my cells. Like, and I don't fundamentally have a problem with that, but what I kind of have a problem with is calling that naturalism. Like, how do you fit that in with? Okay, explain that to me. That's an apparent contradiction. I'm sure you've worked it out.
So let's make a distinction between naturalism and reductionism. Okay. They're not the same thing.
Are they on a dichotomy, or are they just like, you know, apples and oranges?
They're apples and oranges.
Okay, so
they're really two completely different things. Now, as an electrical engineer, the dogma of reductionism in biology makes me want to scream, because living things are not reductionistic. You can't just take the laws of physics and derive, like, we don't know where the stuff comes from. Okay, mm-hmm. We don't know why cells know how to evolve. We just see that they do. Mm-hmm. Okay, now naturalism. I'm okay with methodological naturalism, and here's what I mean by that. No scientist gets to go in the lab and come out and say, God did it, let's take a 3-martini lunch.
Methodological naturalism is that,
well,
don't do that, and you're doing methodological naturalism?
That
seems rather oversimplified.
I might have missed something that you were trying to say there. I'm trying to make this really simple and digestible, and without going into some big philosophical thing. A scientist only gets to use experimental and mathematically modelable explanations for how things work. A scientist doesn't get to say, God did it, let's go out for lunch. Okay, now that now I know that there ultimately you get to requiring an ultimate explanation. But as I explained to Jonathan about a half an hour ago, I'm heavily biased in favor of the universe being able to develop itself.
Okay, now, wait, good question. So the universe developing itself, and that would include like the different types of changes that the organism is doing. Is that happening because the organism has consciousness, or because the universe has consciousness and is doing it?
Well, I don't really know, honestly. They're both a hypothesis, okay? I mean, is there a field out there that the organisms are tapping into, or is the intelligence all on the inside? I don't know. I just know a protozoan can rearrange its own DNA in 100,000 pieces in 12 hours.
But isn't it unfair? Then you're saying I don't know. Let's go out to lunch. Isn't that?
No. I'm saying let's get to work. Let's start having philosophical arguments, and like we can peel the onion another layer, another layer, another layer. Now let me jump to your conscious mind question. Okay. Dutch famine, 1944. The kids conceived during the famine had markedly different metabolism than kids not conceived during that time. And it turns out it was epigenetics. Okay? Right. Now, I doubt that epigenetics comes from our conscious minds going, I think it's all the cells in our body in the magnificent systems of the whole machine that knows we need to do these epigenetic switches and we need to pass these on to our offspring. Now, let me tell you a funny story. This is really cool, okay? I got a friend in Los Angeles. His name is John Torday. He's a researcher at UCLA. He's a genius with evolution stuff, and his area of specialty is the effects of secondhand smoke on children. He spent 30 years of his career studying that. I had coffee with him 2 months ago. He said, Perry, there are 300 documented effects of cigarette smoke on children. He goes, you'll never guess what number one, top of the list, the worst one is. I go, I have no idea. He goes, the worst effect of a smoking relative is epigenetics. Okay, so a woman smokes. Grandmother smokes cigarettes. Her body makes epigenetic changes, which are passed to her daughter, which are passed to her granddaughter. The worst effects of smoke are the epigenetics changes inherited by the granddaughter from the smoking grandmother. Okay. He said, that's top of the list.
This is cool. I love epigenetics. This is not my question.
But I want to point out what's going on, because this is answering your Texas question.
No, it's not. My question was specifically about genetic, not epigenetic changes.
Well, epigenetic changes eventually get hard-coded into genetic changes.
Show me the papers.
I'll have to get that for you. Like, I can't give you that off the top of my head.
That's a proposal.
I think Dennis Noble's book, Biological Relativity, has some of that.
Okay. Well, I'm very skeptical that they have that evidence. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't. That's a proposal, and they put it out at the Royal Society meeting, but nobody that I asked there could explain to me what exactly.
You may be right. You may be right. In fact, let me back up.
So I'm calling your bluff. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm certainly not intending to bluff, but I think it's a very reasonable hypothesis that epigenetic changes, and I'll go take a look at this and I'll put something on my blog.
That'll be good. Okay, so now, I'm not a philosopher. I'm learning these things, and methodological naturalism. What about materialism? Okay, so as far
I
as
hate it.
You hate materialism. What is materialism to you? Like, all causes have to be made of matter or energy.
Well, to me, materialism is almost the same as reductionism. It's everything just comes from matter and energy. Well, let me ask you a question. Does the number 7 exist?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it sure does. And you can't weigh it, and you can't measure it, and it's not real.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm an electrical engineer. Like, if anything, all of this natural genetic engineering stuff that Jim Shapiro is always talking about is highly mathematical.
Okay.
There is an abstract level of what is going on that's not purely physical.
Okay, so question, with materialism, you don't like it, and we agree. I mean, not that I don't care, it's just, I don't believe it reflects reality.
Right.
And what I'm trying to understand, though, is where consciousness comes in. So with materialism, there is really no such thing as consciousness as a conceptual, immaterial thing, because we have to be in a material only world. And that, I guess, is distinguished from methodological naturalism. It must allow for consciousness, since you have consciousness as a mechanism in your idea of how macroevolution works. So, okay. So, but then my question is, if methodological naturalism constrains our scientific processes to be to only those things, to make the only things that are essentially matter and energy discoverable through scientific processes, if I understand it correctly, is that not accurate?
Well, you can still infer. So you can look at the behavior of a drone, let's say, and you can infer that it has a PID control system or something like that. You could come up with some theory about the mathematical formula that controls its operation. And science always involves metaphysical assumptions. Always, mathematics is metaphysical. Okay, and so really, what you end up realizing is that there's no clean separation between the physical and the metaphysical, because there are always assumptions that you have to make, that you have to assume, that you can't prove. But I'm okay with scientists having models. Okay, but I'm also sympathetic with the scientist that goes, I don't want to just assume that there is no explanation for the Cambrian explosion other than an outside of intelligence had to interfere. Like,
why don't you want to? That's really strange. Like, I don't understand. I feel like you have some strange motives driving your approach to doing science. Like, and when I say strange, I'm saying this from like this very, very purist point of view, that like, I would rather be the only person thinking what I think and be if it's true. And if everybody hates me and conversation breaks down, I don't care, as long as what I have is true. Like, if science as a community like burns itself in a flame of fire because of what this idea is, I don't care, as long as it's true. Like, so, but what you seem to be like, and I think it's great, because I understand that I don't really hate, I mean, I don't really like the atmosphere either. I think that, but these are, they're the reason it's that way is because of our humanity, not because of our ideas, right? And that's why I'm like, let's go. So we're on the same page with that, but I really think that the ultimate like end goal, like, and I wanted to ask you about that, like, if we're throwing away a chess piece because we're throwing away evolution, we're throwing away the queen, like, what's the goal of the chess game? Like, shouldn't it be truth and not like, funding or, nature papers?
Okay. So Wisdom of Solomon, I think it's 11 verse 20 or 21 in the Catholic Apocrypha. It's written 2,500 years ago. It says, "Thou hast ordered all things in weight and number and measure."
2,500 years ago.
Yep.
Didn't exist 2,500.
Well, maybe 2,200 years ago, but it seems to come out of Jewish mystics.
Yeah.
It's in the Catholic Apocrypha, okay?
Uh-huh.
Thou hast ordered all things in weight and number and measure.
Okay.
Now, that is the first statement in all of history, in all recorded literature, of a scientific worldview. That is a scientific worldview right there. What that verse is suggesting is that the universe is discoverable and measurable and mathematical.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay? Now, what I'm saying is not strange. What I'm saying is it's actually kind of paradoxical. It's like, yes, I believe in God. Yes, I believe in miracles. But God made the universe for maximum discoverability, and the only way that it's maximally discoverable is if everything that came before humans was a natural process.
Whoa. That's a really strong statement. So what you're the only way that the universe is maximally discoverable is if everything that came before humans was a natural process. And when you say natural, you mean,
or at least from starting with the Big Bang or the first event.
But I thought, okay, so I don't even know where to go from here with that. But if you say that inferences are like making inferences to the best explanation, okay,
Yep.
about causes of effects in the past, it's a valid historical scientific method, then you're going to have events in the past that involve the action of conscious agents. And they're not, by definition, and I'm not even talking about life or whatever, I'm talking about history. I'm talking about, let's do forensics. And I'm saying that those things are by definition not reproducible. And you brought that up as a problem with intelligent design, capital letters. And and I'm like, wait a minute, like nothing that happened in the past is technically reproducible, even if it was this photon bouncing off of that planet, and like, you know, that event will never happen again. Another photon will do it after that, and then we'll see the stream of light. But the point is that you have law-like behaviors, and then you have things that don't behave according to the regular behaviors of matter and energy. And those things are in the realm of the conceptual, the immaterial, or consciousness. And that's how we can infer. Like, we infer these, they have specific attributes. They are intelligible because of those specific attributes. So I don't see that it falls outside of your intelligibility thing. Like I believe it's like God's handiwork, you know, not to like go into theology or whatever, but I don't see the split that I feel like you're trying to make between like the natural things and or maybe I don't like using the word natural because I'm part of nature, but I have an immaterial causality that is part of me, that if I did something and somebody didn't know humans existed, they would be like, oh, this is supernatural. Like, how could wind and erosion have done this, right? But they just need to know that humans exist. And then it'd be like, oh, this is the kind of thing that humans do. So we don't know exactly which human, but a human is most likely explanation for the existence of this thing in the present, even though we know it's been here a really long time.
So what if all living things possess a form of consciousness?
I would think that's great. Why not?
Okay, so is that fall within methodological naturalism to work with things that you can hold in your hands?
I don't know. This is what I think. Okay, let me tell you the answer to this question. Like, if I were to write a crazy grant and send it to a crazy granting institution that would say, yes, this is exactly the kind of crazy experiments we want to be able to do, I would study the mind-body problem, because I want to understand how it is that my consciousness interacts with this matter that I have control over, called my body. And I don't, like, I have one experience with that, and it's my own. And if there was a way to systematically test that, I would be like, yes, let's do that. I need as many guinea pigs as I can, because I think honestly that it would open up some more of our understanding of these types of conscious, like mind over matter type processes that we're saying, or we're inferring to have happened in the past, not necessarily with a human mind in particular, but a mind like ours, which is what ideas. And I'm fully willing to say that might be absolutely off the mark. And like, however the mind that's responsible for the first life, constructed first life, could be completely different from the way that I decide to make my legs move. I don't know, but it's worth scientific exploration. So it's not a science. Like, I don't want to go to lunch and have 3 cocktails. I actually want to study this crap. But it's like, but it's not materialism, and therefore somebody decided, and a bunch of scared people said, yes, we will agree with you. That means it's not science and not fundable, and it's not part of the club. That's the problem.
Well, so if causes come from divine outside consciousness, they are outside the realm of our study. And if causes come from within the Earth's consciousness, then they are subject to study. And I just have a bias, given the choice, that things are within our purview.
Okay, are those two things incompatible? Does it have to be one or the other?
Probably not, but if you say the Cambrian explosion was caused by divine intervention, then you can't study it as a scientific problem.
Why not?
Because God is outside.
Well, it just depends on the type of science you want to use to study it. You can't use empirical science, but it's a historical science.
Well, okay, that's true, but it's not empirical science, and so I have a bias. That everything before humans is subject to empirical science. Now, I might be wrong, but I think it's a productive hypothesis.
But nobody disagrees with that, actually. Who disagrees that anything before a human was able to set up a lab and is not subject to
half of the intelligent design community would disagree with that.
Oh my God.
Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt, is telling us that the Cambrian explosion is only explainable by an outside intelligence. It's just not saying that it's God. They're trying to tell you that naturalistic science can't explain it. They're trying to tell you empirical science.
Okay, we're talking about two different things here. Okay, so when we have empirical science, basically you're asking questions about how things that exist right now do what they do. How do they work? Right. I have a protein in the test tube. I want to know its enzymatic mechanism. Let's pick that apart and do it. That is, now when you have an event in the past, you're never going to put that event in your test tube and be able to manipulate it and find out things about it. It will always be, no matter what, and that makes it a completely different branch of science. And you have to restrict your inferences, using different models and things like that. But that doesn't mean it's not science. So to say that, so that's a separate problem from where the cause came from. So, or like where the intelligent cause is located. You see how he's saying it's like a mind. And he's saying that given the other evidence of like cosmological arguments, that mind is most likely outside of the cosmos, not within the cosmos. Right. And so that's just, I don't see a conflict. I don't see why you would disagree that if it's possible to make plausible inferences, and that's a valid historical scientific method about things in the past, and now and there's no conflict between having intelligence coming from the outside or from as well as in the inside of the organism or of life, the biosphere, to impact in real time what the behaviors and experiences of within populations of organisms are. If there's no conflict there, then I really don't see why you have a problem with ID with.
Well, hang on. So if I say Cambrian explosion, if I say I can take natural genetic engineering, hybridization, horizontal gene transfer, epigenetics, and maybe a few other things, and therefore I can explain the Cambrian explosion, then, or wait, maybe it could even be reproduced, at least in principle. Okay, then that is a naturalistic scientific hypothesis, methodological naturalism, and we can figure it out. If God stuck his finger in earth and made vertebrates, then that is not a scientific hypothesis. It may be logical. It might even be true, but it's not scientific. You can't reproduce it. You can't.
It's scientific.
There's a huge difference.
Historical. Okay, can you get off of it's not scientific? You need to say it's not empirical science. And therefore, it's not reproducible in the lab right in front of you.
Well, it's not scientific either because well, and unless you define the actions of God as falling under the rubric of science, which I do not.
Why not?
God made science, science didn't make God.
That's the reason why you're saying that science must exclude the actions of God? Science is a method to discover truth. And if
I think you're seriously confusing theology with science. I don't think what you're describing is science at all.
Really?
When God appears to Moses, that's not science. You can't make it happen again.
But okay, so again,
it happened. I agree, it happened, but it's not science.
Wow. All right, this is fascinating. So I feel like you're okay. So let's leave to the side. So it seems like you just need that. Whenever God has been involved, no matter what, the way we find out what His involvement has been is through a line of inquiry called theology. And there's no line of inquiry that would involve a scientific methodology that is valid to apply to that event.
Well, it gets awfully murky, but like I can't make God re-deliver the Ten Commandments. Science is repeatable, at least
not historical science. What about the origins of life? Is that repeatable? Was that not science? Is it not science to study the origins of life? It
might be repeatable. I have a $3 million prize if it is.
Oh my gosh.
I don't know.
That's interesting. Okay. All right. So now here's something. I like what you said that and what you would be doing by your bias towards the empirical sciences, because you would be able to get in the lab and study these mechanisms, is actually a part of historical science, because what you're doing is you're studying the causes that are in action right now, right? And when you have the uniformitarian method at work, you say, okay, since these causes are in action right now, then they're the most likely ones to have been responsible for effects in the past. Okay, this is how we just avoid saying the tooth fairy did it in the past. Well, where's the tooth fairy? Well, we don't have the tooth fairy now to test. No, we have these mechanisms now, or these types of causes, and that's great. But one thing that I wonder is, like, when it comes to consciousness, like you use the word inject. So you didn't seem to like the idea of God injecting information, into animals to make the Cambrian explosion happen. But doesn't there have to be an injection of consciousness every time something conscious comes into existence?
I think that question is light years beyond what any scientist knows. But
that's a dodge.
I think that the universe is actually consciousness first, matter second, not the other way around. And you can actually deduce this from the double slit experiments, where this is in quantum mechanics, where something is only a potentiality until it's actually observed. And that's why I brought up Bob Lanza's book, Biocentrism, which is really fascinating. I think the reductionists have it all backwards. This is why they can't explain it. This is why Richard Dawkins is getting on the radio saying life is a happy chemical accident, because that's the only explanation that's available to him. It's not an accident.
Okay, let's not talk about that.
It might be
let's focus on us. We can agree on other people's weird thinking. Let's find out what's weird about our thinking. So the thing is, you shouldn't have a problem with God injecting or, things into our space-time continuum, because you're not a materialist, therefore you don't think that agency is an emergent property of matter and energy, right?
I think matter and energy is an emergent property of agency.
Not my agency, not your agency. Do you make matter and energy? You're not creating matter or energy. Neither am I. Right. And yet,
so I had to come from somewhere.
Right. Okay. But we're not talking about the creation of it, but we're talking about what would you say?
When a baby is conceived, I do not know where its consciousness comes from. That is just so far beyond me. Like, I don't know.
Country, make a hypothesis. Be a scientist.
Oh, come on.
That's too easy to be like, oh, this is too high for me. But you hold the bar this high and say, this is what science is. And it's like, well, hold yourself to the same standard. Like, there are real questions out here that need answers, and you have made like partial proposal, and I'm saying,
look, I'm just giving a set of rules that I should get the questions answered.
A set of, well, I mean, what do you mean?
I just want rules that get us to answers instead of, God did it, that settles it, let's go out for lunch. That is not acceptable.
Wait, you really think that that's what scientists in the ID community are saying is God did it? And
that's
my paper.
Okay. If the Cambrian explosion came as divine intervention, then that's what it is. You can't parse it any further. It's like it was a miracle. We didn't have bodies, these kind of body plans, and boom, then we did. And it came from outside intelligence. Well, that's a miracle. Now, I'm okay with miracles because I've seen them with my own two eyes. But I'd much rather be talking about miracles that you can actually see, that somebody actually witnessed. And if nobody was there, my bias is there's a naturalistic process.
Okay, so
that's
would
all.
You say then that so it's either God did it or some consciousness did it, right?
Yeah, sure.
Right? And so your method would be to test the different mechanisms that consciousness uses to create genetic change. And then
that's what
you do if you find that those are not efficacious to generate a new species, to generate the Cambrian explosion. Like, what are you going to do if the uniformitarian method tells us, that's not good enough?
Well, then I guess science comes to a brick wall.
What?
And so far, uniformitarianism. I mean, I don't know how to do science outside of a uniformitarian context. I don't know how to do it. I mean, maybe it's possible.
But you could. Okay, so
if the rules are changing every 5 minutes, how do we have any hope of figuring anything out?
The rules are not changing because the uniformitarian method also includes the ID proposal. So anyway, I think I should let
not if God had to cause a Cambrian explosion. That's not uniformitarianism.
It is not saying God, by the way. So, anyway, please look up that thing that you said that you were going to look up, and maybe I'll try and email you. And I will look up Ono's 2R hypothesis. I like your stuff about gene duplication. I'm a plant biochemist. I know about lots of gene duplication events. Plants are crazy and interesting, but my definition of species and yours are very different. So this is probably the reason.
I don't think there is any one definition of species, so I just stick to one that works for me. What you got, Jonathan?
Well, thank you, Therese. I was a little surprised, though, Perry, that you, from your perspective, for something to qualify as a scientific proposal, it must be repeatable. Because can you, for example, repeat? Can you repeat the meteorite collision that killed the dinosaurs, for example?
Well, so my definition is actually broader than that, but can you repeat it? Can you model it? Can you, can you construct a sequence? Is there a mathematical framework that will describe it? Or is there, can you run a computer simulation? Or, I mean, I'm an engineer, and I know there's things that you can't reproduce a second time, but you can show in principle that they work.
Right.
You can show in principle that hybridization events work and that transposition events happen. I don't think we can really reproduce the Cambrian explosion, but I think we can, in principle, extract the elements of it.
Mm-hmm. But I think that we can look at natural phenomena and try to discern the types of causes that would be necessary to explain events in the remote past. So, for example, explaining a developmental pathway, for example, going from a zygote or fertilized egg to the baby organism, or producing an irreducibly complex macromolecular machine. We know of only one category of explanation, which has the ability to visualize a complex endpoint and bring everything together that's necessary to actualize the endpoint, and that causes intelligence. And so that's the type of cause or the category of explanation that we need to, I think, propose when we're dealing with these types of systems. Would you not agree?
Right. Well, I agree, but we can also observe that cells do these things. Okay, cells do irreducibly complex things all the time, including their own genomes. And so like the rabbit hole is a lot deeper than most people realize that it is. You know, cells reconstruct their own physiology in real time. So how do they do that? Well, obviously they possess some kind of cognition themselves. So yes, it only raises the bar on the original question. But I think most Christians, most apologists are drastically underestimating what nature can actually do. They have no idea. And it's a really amazing thing to discover when you start to really get into it.
But it seems that you're doing kind of the same thing that James Shapiro does, which is to propose some kind of pre-programmed adaptive capability, which then just sets the question back another level. Okay, so where did the pre-programmed adaptive capability come from? And that, of course,
That's
would be
fine.
mind.
Well, sure. And how far back does the mind go? And how fine-tuned is the universe anyway? We don't know. The highest view of God is a God that can start the whole thing and not have to mess with it after that. I mean, people in business know this very well. You know, which restaurant do you want to run? Do you want to run a restaurant where you as the owner have to be there 14 hours a day, babysitting everybody and juggling things? Or do you want to be a franchise owner who owns a McDonald's and basically a bunch of 16-year-olds with an instruction manual can run the whole entire thing and all the customers get served and you don't even have to be there? Which is to say, McDonald's is a much more successful business than, you know, the restaurant of a guy who's flipping burgers all day. And so, yes, of course you have to have an ultimate explanation. Of course you do. But what most Christians want to do is every time there's something in history that they can't explain, they go, well, God must have come in and did that. And I'm going, you're selling God short when you do that. God made a better universe than that. Much better. It's way better than you think.
Okay, we had a question submitted from Jordan. If someone posited that God directly interacted to heal those people's hearing that you saw, would that be a God of the gaps argument or a reasonable argument?
It's a God of the gaps argument.
Okay.
And I'm good with it.
You're good.
I'm totally good with it. Yep. But if it happened 100 million years ago, my bias is that God made it possible, that God revealed what he did in nature. And if we study nature, we can figure it out.
But in your book, Perry, don't you propose intelligence as an explanation for the origins of the first life?
Possibly.
And would that be God of the gaps?
Well, yeah, but am extremely careful to say, we might find this out. You know, when I put together the Evolution 2.0 prize, like, if somebody wins that thing, they are not calling my bluff, because I think it might be winnable. What I told my investors is, I think there's a 10% chance somebody could solve it in our life. Maybe life is a literal miracle from God, or maybe the universe is much more fecund than people even realize. Maybe the laws of physics and maybe consciousness and maybe the way it all works is much more amazing than anybody gives it credit for. I don't know. But I'm not going to close the door on the possibility that it could be solved.
Rob Ward from New Zealand says, as I listen to Perry's claims, one thing that stands out to me that his claims about nature's inbuilt information should be very testable in the lab. He gave an example, but if his hypothesis is correct, then there should be many more examples. Would Perry say that all organisms have the inbuilt software code to enable them to rapidly evolve? Does that include humans? Did the first cell contain the code to make humans, or did the information pool grow over time?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. Just the first question again.
He says, as I listen to Perry's claims, one thing that stands out to me is that his claims about nature's inbuilt information should be very testable in the lab.
It is testable in the lab, and all living things do have the capability to cut, splice, rearrange their own DNA. Cells have enormous natural genetic engineering capabilities, and humans are micro-evolving all the time. Every generation, there are epigenetic changes that get passed on to the next generation.
I mean, the genomic acrobatics that you talk about, Perry, that James Shapiro also talks about in his read-write genome work, that's very, very prevalent in protozoans, but it seems to be, it's kind of not as common as I understand beyond the protozoan level.
Natural genetic engineering, so transpositions happen in every form of life. Okay?
Yeah, I agree with that, yeah.
Horizontal gene transfer, there are no hard limits. So you can pick up DNA from viruses, you can pick up DNA from bacteria. I think we're only so far scratching the surface of how much is really going on genetically and how dynamic and how read-write the genome really is. Barbara McClintock, in her Nobel Prize paper in 1984, she talks about galls, and galls are they are growths that plants produce when they are impacted by other organisms, insects, and things like that. And galls, on the fly, in real time, generate unique, different genetic sequences that are different for every parasitic creature, every different one. We've only scratched on the surface of what is really going on with biology. I think we currently understand maybe 5% of evolution. I think that's where we're at. I think 5% figured out. I think 95% of it is still uncharted territory.
Okay. Callum says, Perry, I find myself between yourself and ID. I'm sympathetic to a more Aristotelian or Thomistic approach, which sees things having inherent tendencies towards certain states. So I'm not sold on an interventionalist mechanist. However, I think God is needed to explain aspects of reasoning and consciousness, not something that naturally develops, even from things which with inherent tendencies. Wouldn't you say that the intractable consciousness problem is at least a foggy pointer to a theistic cause in nature? This affects their attitude.
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. I think the question of consciousness, and I love Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos. I think he hits the nail right on the head. Like, we don't know what consciousness is. We don't know where it comes from. It's like the biggest mystery. We don't even feel like how do you even probe the question? I'm in favor of trying to find out, but we need to respect the question.
Mm-hmm.
I love what he said.
Ruben commented on something you said earlier in regards to your formulation of the intelligent design arguments that people at Discovery Institute, etc., put forward. And I agree with what Ruben says here. He says he calls his version a syllogism, but syllogisms work deductively, whereas the inference of the best explanation works abductively.
Syllogisms are inductive. They can go. You can have them both ways. Look it up. Yeah. There's inductive logic. There's deductive logic.
Yeah, but
inference is induction.
But in your formulation of the argument, it was basically one, DNA as a code, two, DNA or codes come from intelligence, three, therefore DNA comes from intelligence. That would be a non sequitur in logic. But
well, it's an inference.
Yeah, but it's
not deductive. It's an inference. Yeah.
Okay. Scott Ventura says, hi Perry, great to listen to you. We met at a conference on evolution in Evanston in 2015. What is the fundamental way you would distinguish evolution 2.0 from ID? Are you claiming that the coordination of the processes of evolution are designed to lead to irreducibly complex structures and specify complexity, as opposed to some unknown cause? Doesn't Dembski in the design revolution allow for the type design you described to part of the ID program? Cheers.
I don't know about the last question. I think the whole cosmos is designed to do what it's doing. But I also think the cosmos has freedom to develop in the way that it wants. Like, I believe in free will, and I think humans have free will. And I also think nature has a sort of free will. And of course, this is very philosophical, but I think you can also plainly observe that. I just think it fits what we see around us.
How does Daniel says, how does a naturalistic methodology exclude non-naturalistic causes? ID studies nature using commonly accepted methodologies, but concludes a non-natural agent cause. Couldn't study of nature lead us to think that humans, ancient or modern, are the cause of some archaeological or forensic artifacts?
Well, of course, you can always infer intelligence. I'm just saying that nature has its own intelligence, and this has largely been overlooked, and that organisms are smart enough to evolve, and they do evolve, and we can observe them evolving, and this is the biggest untold story in the history of science. Most people have no idea that evolution happens in real time, literally in 24 hours in a petri dish. That you can get a brand new species by doing, these various things, and people should be talking about this. I don't know if I answered the question, but you can referee this however you want, Jonathan.
Cool. We got a hand raised from Bill Cole. Bill, go ahead.
Oh, I know Bill.
Hello,
Barry. I like Bill. Oh, hi. How are you?
Hi, I'm sorry I was late. I didn't see your presentation, but I want to say hi to you anyway.
Well, hello. It's great to see you again.
It's good. It's great to see what you guys are doing. You and I see things in a pretty similar way. I do think, the discussion before about, what's science and what's not science. And I think empirical science is what you were talking about is the scientific method. Right. And then you have the historical sciences that are using the inference standard. Right. And I think Darwinian evolution uses the inference standard. Darwin originally used the inference standard. And I think ID uses the inference standard. For ID itself, it's fair game if the argument's against Darwinian evolution. I see no reason you can't make that argument. But again, what you say is right, is it's limited. You say it's designed, there's no step B. It's step A, then step B. So,
Right.
so now what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, well, how much of this can we really figure out empirically? Now, what I've stumbled onto, and I think I mentioned to you in an email, is that there's a conflict I've run into just thinking about this, is the DNA repair mechanism and how it works, and how it works in multicellular organisms, and also the apoptosis mechanism. Because I know I've done some cancer research and have been doing that for about a year at this point, and that's all about the cell cycle, cell division, DNA repair, apoptosis. Those are the mechanisms that either create or prevent cancer. It just looks to me like we have a conflict, which is we need for the cell to evolve. We need some and what we look at historically, what the DNA of different organisms look like, we need variation. And what we see as this conflict is the cell is fighting variation in a very hard way, because variation is really bad for the cell unless, as you say, it's controlled by a known mechanism inside the cell. Random variation is an enemy of, and environmental random variation is an enemy of the cell. And I just wanted to get what your current thinking. I know, you said you were thinking about that when we last talked. I wanted to hear what your thinking is there.
So there are two completely different kinds of mutations that go on. There's the random accidental ones, and they happen all the time, from radio waves or X-rays or pathogens or anything. And then there's mutations that are engineered by the cell, and they're completely different, right? It's as different as you and I. If somebody starts pelting us with rocks and garbage, right, we get out of the way, versus playing baseball and playing catch with our kid. They're completely different, and cells know. I don't know how they know this, but they know what they want to do, and they militantly guard against random mutations, and they have apoptosis and all this. And then when they're under stress and they got to re-engineer stuff, they go into hypermutation. So I think there's a level of self-awareness, and maybe it's not self-awareness, but if it's not, then we lack language. Like, I'm sure that if we could actually describe the stuff the way it really is, the human vocabulary would have to exponentially multiply, because what they do is amazing. It is just amazing.
Yeah, and I agree. That needs to be pursued. But a question in my mind is, nobody's pursuing the origin of the hydrogen atom at this point, right? Because it looks like a hard problem. If I were to say to you, who's out there studying the origin of the hydrogen atom? The question is, when do we concede that the origin of DNA for any distinct species is as hard a problem as the origin of the...
Well, I'm not sure. Like, it seems like, I've never studied the origin of the hydrogen atom. It seems like probably something that a particle physicist can model. I don't know. As for DNA, like, I just, I've got quite a few friends who are in the origin of life field, and I can only have some respect for what they do. A lot of times I think their assumptions are sometimes nutty or whatever, and I might disagree with them. But I think you have to honor the pursuit. So
Yeah.
Could
No,
you guys give me like a 2-minute break? I just need to, maybe you and Jonathan go ahead and talk among yourselves, and I'll be right back. Okay.
Absolutely.
You know, I think, Jonathan, I think what Perry says, which is interesting, is that this thing is so convoluted because the conclusions are of Darwinian evolution are so far ahead of the evidence that, you know, we know so little about biology. I know you're pursuing your PhD in molecular biology, so you understand this really well. We know very, very little of what a eukaryotic cell really does. And yet we claim that we know how species transitions occur, and we're not even close to understanding that how that happens if it does indeed happen, you know, naturalistically.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some very strong reason to reject the naturalistic explanations for the complexity and diversity of life on Earth, at least as the primary cause.
Perry, did you talk about your Gödel idea, the Gödel theorem idea?
Boy, that's like a whole, probably another rabbit hole. You know, it's up to you, Jonathan. We have been going long here. I don't know what's
Sure.
normal.
How much further do you want to go? Do you want to wrap up here, or take 1 or 2 more questions, or how long do you want to go?
Let's, if you want to talk about Gödel, I'll be happy to come back and have a whole different conversation sometime. I think that's a very underrated subject. I think it's very worthwhile. If you want to have me back, I'd love to come back and talk about that. But let's try to wrap up the biology stuff. I didn't realize we would go this long, and like I've got, you know, family.
Yeah, of course.
Solve and stuff. So
of course. Well, thanks for coming on. It's been great to have you, and I very much enjoyed the chat. So for folks, we will be on again next week. You can find our website, apologetics-academy.org. Next week, we'll be talking to Jackson Washburn on why he's a Mormon. He'll be giving a defense of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and explaining to us why he buys into that. So we look forward to hearing from him. And yeah, so I'll see you guys all next week. And thanks again, Perry, for coming on.
Hey, it was great to have you all. You can all get 3 free chapters of Evolution 2.0 at cosmicfingerprints.com. And I'll be checking into the, you know, epigenetics question that came up earlier, and sooner or later I'll get a blog post up about that.
Cool. I'll send you the link to the recording also when I have it up on YouTube.
Okay. Very good. Thank you, everybody.
Right. Take care.
Appreciate your time today.
You're welcome. You too.